Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. When Lyndon Johnson took office after the Kennedy administration, he set up an ambitious policy of reform in civil rights, in economics, in the way that people deal with others on the margins. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have three objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to describe Lyndon Johnson's political career. You should be able to summarize the goals and impacts of Johnson's Great Society agenda. You should be able to identify the reforms of the Warren Cart. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 23. Lyndon Johnson was a fourth-generation Texan, and he grew up in the dry hills of the Texas Hill Country in a family of fairly modest means. He entered politics in 1937 in a special election to the U.S. House of Representatives, speaking up for struggling farmers and ranches during the Depression. It was in this role that Johnson caught the attention of Franklin Roosevelt, whose influence allowed Johnson to get support in Congress and to bring about important New Deal projects to South Central Texas. In 1948, he decided to go make the jump to the United States Senate, facing two primary opponents, including a former Texas governor. The election was close that year, but kind of an interesting story about this. In a precinct in South Texas, a county there turned up their ballot box late after most of the other ballots were already counted. And in that ballot box, they found 202 ballots belonging to voters who curiously voted in alphabetical order and who curiously wrote in the same pen and in curiously the same handwriting. Lyndon Johnson won that election by 87 votes out of 988,000 votes cast, earning him the nickname Landslide Lyndon. Sounds totally legit to me. Subpoint B. By 1955, Landslide Lyndon had become the Senate Majority Leader, the most important person in the United States Senate, and had distinguished himself as an effective legislator. He was a master of party politics and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. His people called his legendary ability to persuade senators to support his bills, they called it the LBJ treatment, using this treatment to win over supporters. Johnson's deft handling of Congress led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, a voting rights measure that was the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. Johnson's knack for achieving legislative results captured JFK's attention, too, during Kennedy's run for the White House. To Kennedy, Johnson's congressional connections and his Southern Protestant background made his own drawbacks as a candidate a little less glaring, so he asked Johnson to be his running mate. Johnson's presence on the ticket helped Kennedy win key states in the South, especially Texas, which went Democratic by 47,000 votes. Subpoint C. In 1964, Republicans nominated the conservative Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona to oppose Johnson. Now, Johnson had only been president by this point for a few months, having taken over after Kennedy was assassinated. That was in 1963. By 1964, it's election season, and Johnson's now facing Barry Goldwater. Goldwater believed that the federal government basically had no business trying to, right the economic and social wrongs of poverty and discrimination and lack of opportunity. While those were important issues to Goldwater, he basically didn't see it as the government's job to fix it. He wanted to, he attacked long-established federal programs like Social Security, which he said should be voluntary. A person shouldn't be forced to go contribute to Social Security. He also disliked the Tennessee Valley Authority, which he said should belong to the states, and he wanted the federal government to get out of that business. In 1964, most American people were in tune with Johnson. They believed that the government could help solve America's problems. Moreover, Goldwater had also frightened a lot of Americans by suggesting that he might use nuclear weapons on Cuba and in North Vietnam. Johnson's campaign capitalized on this fear. It produced a chilling television commercial in which a picture of a little girl counting the petals on a daisy dissolved into a mushroom cloud created by an atomic bomb. Where Goldwater advocated intervention in Vietnam, Johnson assured the American people that sending U.S. troops there would offer no solution at all to the real problem of Vietnam. On this promise, in 1964, LBJ won the election in a landslide, winning 61% of the popular vote and 486 electoral votes, while Senator Goldwater won only 52 of those electoral votes. Roman numeral number 14. In the wake of the Kennedy assassination, Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress, urging them to pass the civil rights and tax cut bills that Kennedy had previously sent to Capitol Hill. In February of 1964, Congress passed a tax reduction of over $10 billion into law. And as Democrats hoped, the tax cut spurred economic growth. People spent more with more money in their pockets, which meant more profits for businesses, which increased tax revenues and lowered the federal budget deficit from $6 billion in 1964 to $4 billion in 1966. By May of 1964, Johnson has summed up his vision for America in a phrase, the Great Society. In a speech at the University of Michigan, Johnson outlined a legislative program that would end poverty and end racial injustice. But he told an enthusiastic crowd that this was just the beginning. Johnson hoped to create a higher standard of living and equal opportunity. Then, in July, Johnson pushed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress, persuading Southern senators to stop blocking its passage. It prohibited the discrimination based on race and religion and national origin and sex and granted the federal government new powers to enforce those provisions. Still in force today, the '64 Civil Rights Act remains a vitally important piece in women's and minority rights. Subpoint B. Following these early successes, LBJ pushed on with his bolder agenda to alleviate poverty altogether. Earlier in 1964, he had declared unconditional war on poverty in America and proposed sweeping legislation designed to help Americans on the outskirts of hope. In August of 1964, Congress enacted the Economic Opportunity Act, approving nearly $1 billion for youth programs and anti-poverty measures and small business loans and job training. The EOA legislation also created the Job Corps Youth Training Program, the Volunteers in Service to America, known as VISTA, the Project Head Start to educate underprivileged preschoolers, and the Community Action Program, which encouraged poor people to participate in public works programs. Subpoint C. During 1965 to 1966, the Johnson administration introduced a flurry of bills to Congress. Johnson considered education to be the key which can unlock the door to the Great Society. The Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act of 1965 provided more than $1 billion in federal aid to help public and parochial schools purchase textbooks and new library materials. It's amazing to think that there are schools with libraries and textbooks. Subpoint D. LBJ and Congress changed Social Security by establishing Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare provided hospital insurance and low-cost medical insurance for almost every American age 65 or older. Medicaid also extended health insurance benefits to welfare recipients, to the people that otherwise wouldn't have health insurance. Subpoint E. Congress also made important decisions that shifted the nation's political power from the rural areas, where it had been dominant, to urban areas. Congress appropriated money to build somewhere around Congress had appropriated money to build some 240,000 units of low-rent housing and helping low and moderate income families go pay for better private housing to try to improve the living conditions of people. Also, Congress helped establish the Department of Housing and Urban Development, known as HUD, headed by Robert Weaver, the first African-American cabinet member in American history. Subpoint F. The Great Society also brought along profound changes to the nation's immigration laws. The Immigration Act of 1924 and the National Origins Act of 1924 had established immigration quotas that discriminated strongly against people from outside of Western Europe. That act had set a quota of about 150,000 people annually and discriminated against Southern and Eastern Europeans and barred Asians outright. The Immigration Act now of 1965 opened the door for many non-European immigrants to come settle in the United States and ended quotas based on nationality. Subpoint G. In 1962, a book known as Silent Spring was written by Rachel Carson, had exposed a hidden danger, the effects of pesticides on the environment. Reactions to Silent Spring kicked off America's environmental movement. Carson's book and the public outcry resulted in the Water Quality Act of 1965, which required states to clean up their rivers and fix water pollution. Subpoint H. No president in the post-World War II era extended the power and the reach of the federal government more than Lyndon Johnson. The optimism of the Johnson presidency fueled an activist era in all three branches of government. The war on poverty did seem to help. The number of poor people fell from 21% of the population in 1962 to just 11% of the population by 1973. However, though, many of Johnson's proposals, though well-intended, were hastily conceived and proved pretty impossible to accomplish. Johnson's massive tax cut spurred the economy, but the massive spending of the Great Society contributed to a growing budget deficit, a problem that would continue for decades. It may actually still be continuing. Questions about the federal government's finances and debates over the effectiveness of these programs and the role of the federal government, it left people pretty disillusioned and pretty burned out on maybe what seemed like too big of overreach from Washington, D.C. And a conservative backlash began to take shape as a new group of Republican leaders rose to power. Thousands of miles away, the increase in communist forces in Vietnam also began to overshadow the goals of the Great Society. 4 years after initiating the Great Society, Johnson, who was a peace candidate in 1964, would be labeled a hawk, a supporter of one of the most divisive wars in United States history, that of the Vietnam War. Roman numeral number 25. Here I want to talk about the Supreme Court, the sometimes forgotten branch of American government. And there were some important changes that came about here in the 60s. Earl Warren had been appointed by he was Thomas Dewey's vice presidential candidate. So Thomas Dewey, the Republican candidate that lost to Truman in the Dewey defeats Truman race. Earl Warren was Thomas Dewey's vice presidential running mate in 1948. The Republicans lost that election to Truman, and Warren had been governor of California. And in 1953, Eisenhower appointed him as Chief Justice to the Supreme Court. Eisenhower, who was a moderate Republican, expected Warren to be a similar moderate. It looked like that's what his time had been in governor of California, and certainly the chops put out by Thomas Dewey had suggested that he was also going to be a moderate Republican-style Chief Justice. Warren had a long political history as a right-leaning centrist with a broad appeal across party lines. But once he was named Chief Justice, Earl Warren began one of the biggest transformations of the judicial system since John Marshall had done it back in 1800. Beginning with the 1954 landmark decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, which ruled school segregation to be unconstitutional, the court under Chief Justice Earl Warren took an activist stance on leading issues of the day. Several major court decisions in the 1960s affected American society. The Warren Court banned prayer in public schools and declared state-required loyalty oaths to be unconstitutional. It limited the powers of communities to censor books and films and said that free speech, including the wearing of black armbands to school by anti-war students. Furthermore, the Warren Court brought about changes in the federal and state reapportionment in the criminal justice system, reshaping the way that not only Congress would be chosen, but also the way that the laws would be carried out. Subpoint B. In a key set of decisions, the Warren Court addressed the issue of reapportionment, or the way in which states draw electoral districts based on the changing number of people in them. By 1960, around 80% of Americans lived in cities and suburbs. However, many states had failed to change their congressional districts to reflect this development. And so instead, the rural districts, who might actually have fewer than 200,000 people, and some urban districts had more than 600,000 people, yet they were claiming the same number of votes in Congress. Thus, the voters in rural areas had more representation and also more power than those in urban areas. This had the systematic way of both disenfranchising urban people, but also keeping minorities down and struggling and overweighting the power of whites in the rural areas. Maybe the biggest example of this was the 1962 decision Baker versus Carr. The court asserted that the federal courts had the right to tell states to reapportion or redivide their districts for more equal representation. In later decisions after Baker v. Carr, the court ruled that congressional boundaries should be redrawn so that districts would be equal in population, and that extends the principle of one person, one vote to state legislative districts also. These decisions led to a shift in political power throughout the nation from rural to urban areas. Subpoint C. Other Warren Court decisions greatly expanded the rights of people accused of crimes. And here there's going to be several of them, and they're all really important to how our country thinks about justice. Maybe the first one was Mapp versus Ohio in 1961, where the court ruled that evidence seized illegally could not be used in state courts. It's called the exclusionary rule and says that police have to follow the law too. The next case we'll talk about is called Gideon v. Wainwright, that justices required criminal courts to provide free legal counsel to those that couldn't afford it. That everybody has the right to an attorney, and if you can't afford one, then the court needs to go find you an attorney. In Escobedo versus Illinois in 1964, the justices ruled that an accused person has a right to have a lawyer present during police questioning. That a person's right to an attorney isn't just limited to the courtroom; it's at every phase of the justice system. In 1966, this court went even one step further in Miranda versus Arizona, where it ruled that all suspects must be read their rights before questioning, which, if you've ever seen a cop show or if you get arrested a lot, then you know that a person has to be read their rights. That's called the Miranda rights, and they come from this decision. These rulings greatly divided public opinion, though. The liberals praised the decisions, argued that they placed necessary limits on police power and protected the rights of all citizens to a fair trial. On the other hand, conservatives bitterly criticized the court. They claimed that Mapp and Miranda were benefiting criminal suspects, people that had actually been breaking the law, and it severely limited the power of police to go investigate crimes. And don't we want to help the good guys actually win every now and then? You could see this was a pretty contentious issue. During the late 1960s and 1970s, Republican candidates for office seized on this question of the crime issue, portraying liberals and Democrats as being soft on crime and citing the decisions of the Warren Court as major obstacles to fighting crime. This question of liberals holding power and conservatives challenging against it, well, we're just getting that story started, and a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.